Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's NAC at Home program. My name is Mitch Case, and I'm with the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public. This includes exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures and readings, and much more. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as YouTube. If you are interested in becoming a member of the NAC or would like to learn more information, please email us at admissions@thenationalartsclub.org. Now I'm going to share a message from Michelle Kidwell-Gilbert, Chair of the club's Archaeology Committee, who will introduce today's program.
Thank you, Mitch. I am Michelle Kidwell-Gilbert, Chair of the Archaeology Committee, and I'm delighted to be here. It is my pleasure to welcome today's audience of over 400 individuals joining us for a fascinating lecture entitled Thebes, Forgotten City of Ancient Greece, given by Professor Paul Cartledge. He addresses us remotely from England, where I know many attendees also reside. Some of those watching may be new to the National Arts Club's online broadcast and are participating since the program was shared by the New Criteria as one of their editor picks. I thank you, New Criterion. I hope you'll return to our stimulating cultural events in the future. Paul Cartledge previously spoke about revisiting ancient Greece via Alexandria in Egypt, as well as the ancient Olympic Games, and will eventually treat Sparta, where he became an honorary citizen. Emeritus A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture in the Faculty of Classics, he taught at the University of Cambridge and holds the Gold Cross of the Order of Honor, awarded by the President of the Hellenic Republic. But most impressive of all, and notice when Googling Professor John Borgman, under whom Paul completed his dissertation devoted to early Sparta, I came across, and I quote, "Notable student Paul Cartledge. Bravo. What can one say about a lineage tracing back in time to Sir John Beazley, then on to Sir John Borgman, and concluding with Paul? Any statement from me would clearly be redundant. Archaeology teaches much through humanistic explorations into the past and helps us understand the present with lessons engendering a more sanguine future. Our committee has presented a greater number of programs on Greek themes than on any other subject. Knowledge of Hellenic antiquity, humankind's shared cultural heritage, with its emphasis upon glorious beauty and soaring intellectual thought, enriches life while at the same time affirms morality, negating decadence. This afternoon, we are all Greeks by choice. Paul, I welcome you.
I'd like to begin with a few words, and then I shall move to my slideshow in a couple of moments. Thank you so much, Michelle, for inviting me. I think this must therefore be my fourth occasion. Sadly, remotely, I'd far rather be in Gramercy with you at the National Arts Club than here in deepest South Cambridge. But that's the way things are these days. One has to put up with what one has. And it is certainly the case that I don't think 400 people or any such number would have fitted into the club in New York. So there are pluses, there are pros, as well as minuses and cons. I'd also like to thank Mitch. It's really good to have him, forgive the pun, but on the case, a really expert technical helper. And I'd like also to thank the colleague who put together the slideshow that I'm going to take you through quite briskly. And her name is Dr. Anastasia Christofilopoulou, a little bit of a mouthful, but she is a curator at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, of which I am an honorary keeper of antiquities. As Michelle has said, I did an archaeological doctorate, but by John Boardman's standards, and by the way, he's still going pretty strong, he's now 93, I'm not strictly an archaeologist, but a crypto-archaeologist, whereas I suppose what I would call myself is an archaeohistorian. That is, I try to marry physical evidence, material culture, with the written remains, whether documentary or otherwise, to produce a richer mix of history in the big sense, in the broad sense, and in this case of a particular city in ancient Greece, namely Thebes, or as it's called today, Theva. And I realize I'm speaking under the auspices of the Archaeology Committee, and I'm really proud and pleased to do that. But there is a big problem, and it's the same problem, for example, that Sparta has, that archaeologically speaking, ancient Thebes is very difficult of access. For one very simple reason, it is that all ancient, all pre-modern habitations and other uses of the site of Thebes are directly under modern Thebes. So it's only, as it were, in rescue excavations that it's at all simple to get access to the archaeology of ancient Thebes. But we do the best we can, and there is a certain amount, and work has been going on by both foreigners and by local Greeks today, of course, the Greek Archaeological Service, since the late 19th century in particular. And there is a magnificent new museum, and it's a great regret of mine that I didn't manage to get there before the recent lockdowns. I was planning to go, and I haven't yet managed to penetrate the portals. I have, on the other hand, been to the old Museum of Thebes, and an excellent catalogue was produced of that. So when I was writing my book, I had both the modern Museum of Thebes and its very many excellent online presentations, as well as the older excavations and the older catalogue and so on of the older museum. As you probably all know, 2020 going into 2021 is a rich period in terms of anniversaries, and I'll just mention two. Next year, 2021, is the bicentenary of the rising up, the Epanastasis, of certain Greeks who for centuries, almost 4 centuries, had been subjects of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, an Islamic empire, but nevertheless a relatively tolerant one. In other words, Greeks were not compelled to convert to Islam. They were permitted to maintain their ancient faith, which of course goes back to the 4th century in Constantinople, and goes back to the 1st century in terms of Christianity. So it wasn't by any means the worst empire in the whole world that there's ever been. Nevertheless, the Greeks, and of course there's an edge to this, because relationship between the modern state of Greece and the modern state of Turkey, they're not brilliant. Let's put it that way. There are all sorts of pressure points, Cyprus being probably the nastiest, though not directly affecting mainland Greece. And there will be huge celebrations beginning in March 2021. There is another set, and this more immediately applies to me and our subject this evening. 2020, 2021, depending on how you do the maths, is the 2500th anniversary of what we call the Persian Wars, for short, the Greco or Helleno-Persian Wars. 490, Battle of Marathon, 480, 479, huge invasion from Persia, because Marathon had been a Persian defeat that had to be avenged, the largest amphibious invasion of Europe before D-Day, that is June the 6th, 1944 CE or AD, and therefore a really big deal, which one could argue, so transformed ancient Greek culture and civilization that it made ancient Greece, Hellas, what it had to be in order for it to be one of our Western cultural ancestors, through the Romans, through the Byzantines, through the early modern Renaissance, the Enlightenment, right through to the 20th and 21st century. But it's these Persian wars that were pivotal. And this is where, sadly, my subject today is in a bit of an embarrassed situation. Because Thebes, actually for quite good reasons, but nevertheless, just as Pearl Harbor, in the words of FDR, was a day that will live in infamy, the Thebans' reaction to the Persian invasion of 480 lived in infamy for a very, very long time because the Thebans chose the Persian side. Instead of joining the relatively few Greeks who were brave enough to organize a resistance led by Sparta, mainly on land, and Athens, the principal power at sea, resisting therefore the amphibious invasion by land and sea, Thebes went instead, partly because almost every Greek community from its region north had gone over to the Persians, but also, and this is where it gets a little more nasty, because it is thought certain Thebans who ran the state then actually thought the Persians are bound to win. Persians quite like ruling their subjects through small cliques, what the Greeks called dynastai, or narrow oligarchies. They didn't much like, to put it crudely, democracies. So Thebes, being an oligarchy, being actually an extreme oligarchy, the rulers thought the Persians will be nice to us, we'll be in a really good position. After the other silly Greeks have been defeated, no bother, we will then be sitting pretty. Well, it didn't work out that way at all. And 145 years later, the Thebans really paid the absolute maximum price for their treachery, as it was seen, to the Hellenic, the Greek cause, by having their city physically annihilated, almost annihilated, destroyed utterly and uninhabited for a couple of decades. So I'll come back to that in various contexts. The book on which my talk is based was published, quite oddly, in this sense, in the States first, before it was published in England. So it's published in New York by Abrams, and I'm really grateful. They did a really, really good job. And it was dedicated, the book is dedicated to the late Peter Mayer, American, though actually born coincidentally in London, but one of the most brilliant people I had the privilege to know, in particular as a publisher. And I met him, and he owned and published through Overlook Press down in Soho, in south of Houston in New York. And I would meet him regularly. In the early part of 2006, 2010, I held a global distinguished professorship at New York University. So we'd meet for breakfast at the Mercer kitchen. And I very much treasure my memory of that. And I regret that he's no longer with us. So I had three main reasons for writing this book. And Peter encouraged me to do so, though he didn't see it into print. First, Thebes was or has been forgotten, and that's the title of the book, or lost in various senses. It was in antiquity squeezed between the other three, or rather the three major ancient Greek powers. Sparta, I've already mentioned, Athens, I've already mentioned. And the third one is Macedon, the kingdom of Macedon, which came to huge prominence in the middle of the 4th century BCE, that is in the 350s, under the rule first of Philip II, and then of Philip's son, very famous Alexander, who became, after Philip's assassination, Alexander III, and later Alexander the Great, or as the Greeks call him, in one word, Megalexandros, great Alexander. He's rolled together like Charlemagne or Karl der Große in German. Well, it was he, Alexander, who in 335 ordered the near total destruction of Thebes, using as his pretext or his reason Thebes's prior treachery at a time of conflict between Greeks and Romans, and Greeks and Persians, because he, Alexander, was just about to go and launch, to join what he was presenting as a kind of crusade of Hellenism against Persia, the barbarian, the destroyer of the Acropolis of Athens and all that other stuff so many years ago. And Alexander therefore used Thebes as a kind of whipping boy to encourage pro-Alexander, pro-Macedonian support, and to negate, to try to preempt any sort of resistance that might conceivably arise as Alexander was in Asia. And he was, in fact, in Asia for the rest of his life, from 334 to 323. So Thebes, though very important, tended to get squeezed between those three and never produced a major historian or anybody who would celebrate the deeds of Thebes in a way that would be memorable right down to our own time. And secondly, there's a second reason why it was squeezed, and that is, unfortunately, there was another Thebes in the ancient world, and some of you may know that other Thebes much better than my Thebes, because I'm talking about Thebes in Egypt, which is roughly modern Luxor, and that was the capital of New Kingdom Egypt in the second half of the 2nd millennium BC. So it's a really big deal. It's where Ramesses II ruled from and so on. So why was it called Thebes? Well, that wasn't its Egyptian name. It was called Thebes because already in a very early Greek text, Greeks had referred to that place in Egypt as Thebes. And so that's the fact. And then, of course, much later on, after Alexander the Great, Egypt becomes an Egyptian Greek kingdom. It's Hellenistic, we say, post-Alexander, with a new capital, Alexandria. Well, then Thebes, Greek name, comes into its own, but it had always been there. It's mentioned, Egyptian Thebes, already in Homer, the very earliest ancient Greek text that survived. So poor old Greek Thebes had to contend with Egyptian Thebes. Second reason for my wanting to write the book was that Thebes, ancient Greek Thebes, at certain periods really was historically not only interesting, but actually very, very important. And I'll just mention one reason for that now, which I hope will appeal to my American listeners. It certainly appeals to me. Namely, Thebes, for much of its classical history, was a federal state. In other words, though it was an individual city, its power was expressed through being the principal town or city of a federal state known as Boeotia. And then at a great point, when it was at its maximum power, and I'm going to come on to that one particular slide, Thebes actually exported federalism. It founded a new capital of a federal state in the southern part of Greece, in the Peloponnese. And the capital city, which was new, was called Megalopolis, the great city. That's where the word megalopolis first appears. And it was founded specifically from and by Thebes, because Thebes was itself federal. The third reason is that the man most responsible for founding Megalopolis and in other ways transforming the scene in mid-4th century BC Greece, a man called Epaminondas, so happens he is probably, it's a tough call, but my ancient Greek history hero, and not mine alone, because Sir Walter Raleigh, he got certain things wrong. He died in the Tower, but nevertheless, he wrote a history of the world. And he too thought that Epaminondas was probably the greatest of all the ancient Greeks, greater even, in other words, than Alexander the Great, which is an interesting point. Well, one last preliminary point before I share my slides with you. There were really, as I discovered researching the book, two ancient cities of Thebes, not one. There was the city of history, and that's the one I've been talking about, the federal capital and so on and so on. But there was also a city of myth. Ancient Greek word myth just means a traditional tale. And it might, and probably typically does, concern religion, but it needn't. And it concerns, for example, city foundations. Well, the Thebans were particularly good at inventing their own myths. They invented their own epic poetry. However, and this is a function of one of those factors that I've already mentioned, that it was squeezed between the histories of Sparta, Athens, and so on. The Athenians, though they were very receptive to Theban myth and they transformed it, they used it for their own purposes, were not at all keen on preserving it as such for the enhancement of the reputation of the Thebans, so that we don't have anything but scraps of those epic Theban poems, which would have ranked with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, ranked in the sense that they were very early, they were major, lots of Greeks knew about them, but they were not preserved. And that's why we are very often in the dark. But it's from that cycle of Theban myth, and I'm just going to give you two names, I'll come back to both, that come Oedipus and Antigone. And Oedipus and Antigone were both father and daughter and brother and sister, half brother and half sister. In other words, there was a terrifically dark tale at the heart of certain Theban myths, which of course made them attractive to outsiders, and they're still attractive today, but nevertheless don't necessarily reflect as brilliantly as they might on Thebes. And the final point I make, just before I turn to the slides, is that the Athenians were, yes, let's be fair, though I'm a Spartan honorary citizen, I'll have to give them this, the cultural capital of ancient Greece, before Alexandria, and then Rome and so on. But in the initial 6th, 5th centuries BC, Athens, 4th century, Plato, Demosthenes, Aristotle was attracted there and so on. Well, the Athenians were snooty, and they were fairly near neighbors of the Thebans, with whom they were often at loggerheads physically, i.e. they were at war because they were in different sides politically. And there is a phrase which appears as early as the early 5th century BC, Boeotian swine or pigs, which is an Athenian derogation, denigration of their Theban near neighbors. And it's that incubus of prejudice that I've tried to have a go at shedding and, giving the Thebans a bit of a shout. So here we go. So you notice a slight difference of title. Instead of forgotten city, lost city. Well, that won't be a surprise to you now, because it was physically lost for 20 years, between 335 and 315. And to be honest, it never recovered the excellence, the éclat, the prestige that it had had before it was destroyed on Alexander's orders in 335. So we start with just a map of Aegean Greece, the Eastern Mediterranean, what's sometimes called Old Greece, to distinguish it from the wider Hellas, which was created by the diaspora out from this Aegean basin, west as far as eventually Marseille, Massalia in southern France, North Africa, in Libya, Cyrene, for example, and Egypt, of course, the Nile Delta, and then up through the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, through the Bosporus Strait, where Istanbul today is, Constantinople before that, Byzantium before that, right up into the Black Sea. So Hellas is a cultural concept, and Greeks never have called themselves Greeks. That's a Latin word, Graiki, which we then have anglicized into Greeks. But Greeks call themselves, always have, Hellenes, Hellenes. And of the Hellenic family, if you like, one of the major branches was indeed the Boeotians, who spoke their own Boeotian dialect of Greece. And of the Boeotian ethnos, as they called themselves, that is the group which have in common not just that they're all Greeks, but that they're Boeotian Greeks who speak a Boeotian dialect. They write their alphabet in a Boeotian way, and so on and so on. They have Boeotian ways of worshipping the common Greek gods, and they have their own peculiar gods as well. They're focalized, if you can see, just move your eye up from Athens, a little way to the north and to the west, you hit Thebes. It's about 90 kilometers by road, 55 miles or so, and less than that as the crow flies, and really quite interconnectable. You know, there's no major barrier that stops Athenians going to Thebes or Thebans going to Athens. And so that's the area on which this talk will be focused. Homing in a little more closely, the red area on the left map is the Boeotian region. And its most important distinguishing feature is no longer there. If you go there today, expecting to see, and you notice a lake in the map on the right, it's gone, it's dried up. And that is Lake Coppais. And it performed two major functions in antiquity, which now it can no longer perform. One, it divided up the region of Boeotia such that the two major cities, there were about 20, 25 altogether separate Boeotian communities. The most important were on the east and south, Thebes, and then go across to the northwest and you come to Orchomenos. And the history of Boeotia is not one of constant unity, but rather of a lot of disunity, overcome by Thebes rising to become the most important city, and sometimes exercising its hegemony, its dominance of Boeotia in not the most pleasant ways. Pericles, who was of course an Athenian, and he had skin in the game of being rude about the Thebans, he said the Thebans are like very tall trees in a forest. When the wind, a terrific gust blows, the tops of the trees crash together and they actually knock each other's tops off. So he said the Boeotians are like trees like that they are their own mutual executioners. Well, sadly, at least I think it's sad, not only did the Boeotians, like most Greeks, fight an awful lot, fight outsiders, but they also fought each other, even to the extent of destroying whole towns or cities and making the populations of those towns exiles in pursuit of what they considered to be a higher order form of politics. So just to set the scene, this is not, the tale I'm telling you is not one of nice, easy coexistence, but one of antagonism, a good ancient Greek term, in the extreme, resulting in execution and death. So here's another map of Greece without any of the coordinates, without any of the topography shown up in terms of contours, just a flat map with places on it. And I'm taking you back to the second millennium BC, and specifically the second half, exactly where I mentioned Ramesses II of Egyptian Thebes, Luxor, was flourishing, because this was the time in which, in the ancient Hellenic world of that day, there was some form of uniformity of culture, such that places like Thebes, Athens, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, I've underlined them specifically because these are the most important fortified centers, looked somewhat alike. And it's this period mythically onto which the poets of the Homeric tradition, issuing ultimately in the Iliad and the Odyssey of the 8th, 7th centuries BC, BCE. It's this period which the supposed War of Troy presupposes. In other words, there's no other time at which Greeks of this sort of era, we're talking about the late Bronze Age in technological terms, could conceivably have unified and united to, well, do we believe they really went to Troy to rescue Helen, or whatever reason you think? If there was ever anything like such a coordinated collaborative exercise, it could only have happened roughly in the 13th century. And the very important points about Thebes are, A, that it is there. It was one of the most important cities of that time in reality. And that in myth, in the Iliad, it's the region of Boeotia contributed the second largest numbers of ships to the expedition, after only the number supplied by the overall great king, Lord Agamemnon of Mycenae, rich in gold, down in the Peloponnese. So one marker, one distinctive feature of what we call Mycenaean Hellas or Greece is that it is in this period, probably, well, datably, from about 1400 BC, BCE, that the Greeks become literate. For the first time, they write down a version of their probably different Greek dialects, but the existing evidence is nothing like as sharply differentiated between, let's say, writing in Thebes, as you see on the screen, and writing on a document from Mycenae. They're much more similar to each other in language and form than, say, the use of Greek in Thebes in the 5th century BC as compared to the dialect of Greek used in Mycenae, in the Argolid, in the 5th century BC. So one of the markers, the sort of ways in which we distinguish this type of civilization, is that it was bureaucratic. It was also monarchical. There's enough evidence from the tablets, as we call them, to show this is a very hierarchical, heavily centralized form of distributive economy. In this case, in Thebes, the scribes are listing quantities of grains and wool for tax purposes, and about 250 bits and pieces, some more whole than others, of clay tablets with linear B syllabic writing incised on them have turned up from Thebes, or more particularly from the main feature of ancient, as indeed of modern Thebes, which is its whacking great Acropolis. And its Acropolis was known in antiquity, and this is a part of myth rather than history, as the Cadmire. In other words, the place of Cadmos. And Cadmos, in myth, was the founder of Thebes, which is very, very extraordinary because he wasn't, not only was he not Boeotian, he wasn't even Greek. He'd been born and brought up a prince in Tyre, which is in what the Greeks called Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. And he had a sister called Europa. And there's another irony, because Europa gives her name to Europe, even though she was herself an Asiatic. well, how come Europa made the journey across the Aegean to, across the Mediterranean to mainland Greece? Because the Greeks' chief god, a male, of course, Lord Father Zeus of Mount Olympus, he was, shall we say, somewhat indiscriminate in his sexual tastes, or at least he was insatiable in his sexual appetite. And he took a fancy, to put it mildly, to Europa, transported himself to, as it were, Lebanon, grabbed her, took her back, did what he wished with her to Europa, and then dumped her. And Cadmos, incensed, set out in pursuit, and indeed eventually fetched up in Boeotia. And the story of Europa is more complicated. It involves Crete as well as mainland Greece, but I'm not going to go there. At any rate, Cadmos allegedly consulted the Delphic oracle, and Delphi is between Thebes and Athens, so it's very close to Thebes, actually. And whether or not there was really a Delphic oracle there is another question altogether. But anyway, it's Apollo's oracle. It's an oracle of Apollo speaking through a priestess. And he was told to seek out a cow, and wherever a particular cow lay down, there he was to found Thebes. And so he found a cow suitably, and it lay down suitably near the Acropolis of Thebes, which became the Cadma, because he, Cadmos, was the founder of Thebes. The much less exciting reality behind prehistoric Thebes, the first city of Thebes, if you like, is the evidence of such tablets as these, which were written on wet clay and then would have been lying around and they would have dried. But the reason they've survived in the way they have is that they were baked accidentally, or you could put it another way, deliberately, by the people who destroyed that palace of Cadmos, whatever you like to call it, in Thebes, round about the 13th century, mid-13th century BC. And that's really the end, not just in Thebes, but in the Mycenaean world generally, of a terrific economic advance. And there's a terrific recession. Some people even talk of a dark age, lasting in some cases for centuries, until things pick up again in the 9th, 8th centuries. And just before we leave the prehistoric period of Thebes, I show you a pyxis, which is a toilet or toilette box, presumably therefore owned by a woman, and a very wealthy woman, because it's made from ivory, from imported, therefore, elephant ivory. But the reason I single this out, I suppose it's obvious enough, is it shows an originally Oriental type of figure, a Sphinx, in this case heraldically opposed, but with the added feature, you've all seen the famous Sphinx of Egypt, with the added feature of wings. Now, what gender these sphinxes are here, it's hard to tell, isn't it? But I guess one would say possibly male, possibly female. But the important thing about the Theban version of the Sphinx, which I'll come on to, is that she is female. And that's because, or at least I say that's because, in the Greek imagination, anything that was really scary, that was sort of monstrous and supernatural, was typically gendered by, I think, mainly male inventors as female. So the female daimon is potentially scary. And so the Greek Sphinx, the one that Oedipus has to contend with, confront, and solve the riddle of, is female, as opposed to the original, which the Greeks borrowed from Egypt and the Near East, that was male. So, as I said, after the fall of Mycenaean civilization, great crash around about 1200 into the 12th century and lasting 2-3 centuries, we're now in the 8th century BC. And I illustrate this for several reasons, because, first of all, it was found in Thebes. but it is now in the British Museum, as quite a lot of artifacts from the ancient Greek world, of course, are. And though Thebes is inland by a considerable distance, it does have access due east, pretty much, to the Aegean, to the sea. And for example, it was from a Boeotian town, Aulis, that Agamemnon, allegedly in the great Iliadic myth, set sail to go to rescue Helen, who'd been snatched by Paris, Prince of Troy, on the Hellespont. So it's not the case that Thebes was totally non-maritime and inland, but it seems that it never had a navy of its own, a real one, until the 4th century BC. So we're talking about 400 years or a little less after this kratia, which means a mixing bowl for wine and water, was created. But of course, this was created in Athens, not in Thebes. But some wealthy Theban thought it was worth getting hold of, or somehow acquired it, perhaps as a gift, perhaps by purchase. And his relatives, when he died, thought it was worth placing it in his grave. Whenever you see a whole pot or nearly whole pot, you know that it's come from a grave. But does this show a real scene? For example, a captain of a, could it be a trading vessel? Could it be a sort of super pirate vessel? Or does it show a mythical scene? And it's the figure on the very far left that has convinced most people, most observers, that this is indeed an early mythographic, mythological scene, because it is thought that the figure leading a woman onto the boat, that's what it looks like, and he's grasping her very firmly by the wrist, which again looks like it's not just helping her on board in a gentlemanly way, but that this could be, in other words, Paris and Helen, that Trojan myth. And interestingly, if so, getting a bit of an outing in Thebes, even though conversely, the Athenians were not that keen on promoting Theban myths at this time. There is another possible explanation, since it's made in Athens or Attica, the region of which Athens is the capital, that this is Theseus rescuing, this is the nice explanation, Ariadne, where that cad Dionysus, Dionysus is more the cad, is less of the cad in this case, excuse me. Theseus has been helped by Ariadne to escape from the Minotaur on Crete. He then takes Ariadne to Naxos, but then dumps her on that Cycladic island, and Dionysus, god Dionysus, rescues her. Well, this could be either Theseus or Dionysus doing something with Ariadne, who knows? And that's the problem, of course, with iconography, the interpretation of images where you don't have a text in order to help you out. You don't know what the artist's intention was. Here we do know what the artist, or rather the dedicant's intention was, because he spells out, whether he wrote the text himself, Mantiklos, we don't know. Did he have a professional scribe inscribe it for him? And it's actually rather, as you can see, convolutedly inscribed on the guy's thighs and around his genitals. It's the most interesting inscription. It says, I read it out, Mantiklos, and that's probably based on the root mantis, which means a priest, a diviner. Dedicated me as a tithe. A tithe of what? Well, a tithe of some economic gain, of which a tenth can be somehow resolved into the purchase, the commissioning and the purchase of really quite an expensive solid cast bronze figurine of the early 7th century BC. We're in the 670s or so here. And he's dedicating him as a tithe to the far shooter, the bearer of the silver bow, Phoebus, the shining one. And I've put in brackets Apollo, because that's what any Greek reading this would instantly have known it was for him. But then look at the sting in the tail. And this is actually not peculiar to Mantiklos or to Thebans or Boeotians, but this is a very common mode of transfer of transaction between Greeks, humans, and their gods and goddesses and heroes and heroines. The Latin phrase is, I give that you may give me back something equivalent or ideally even more in return. So this Mantiklos is not at all delicate about it. He doesn't say, please, as it were. He says, give something pleasing in return. Rather nice exemplification of the way in which Greeks conceived of their relationship with the gods, of mutuality. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Here is another gift also to Apollo from another sanctuary called the Pataueon, because it's a sanctuary in which the god Apollo was fused with the local hero Patauos. It's not far from Thebes, a major sanctuary quite high up on the top of a hill, from which, well, about 100 of huge life-size marble statues of men, naked men, such as this one, have been excavated, in fact, excavated by the French. And I illustrate this partly to show you what, if you are very wealthy and you want the goodwill of Apollo or any particular god, what you're prepared to go to in the way of expense. It's said that to carve a marble life-size statue of this sort would have taken the craftsmen or craftsmen about a year. So this is pretty expensive. You expect to get a good return from this. He's called a kouros, which in Greek means youth, and typically is used of a naked youth. In the ancient Greek world, nudity was something that was celebrated for males, not for women. It was very rare in public imagery to have women shown less than fully clothed. But to be a kouros was to be on the boundary, on the edge of full, robust manhood. And this is a sort of marker of one's place, both in the world and within one's particular community. And as you can see, it's now housed, together with many, many others, in the Thebes Museum. So I've looked so far at really more on the historical side. We started in the late Mycenaean period. We looked at a linear bead tablet. I talked about the fall of Mycenaean civilization, the Dark Age, then the recovery in the 8th century, such that a particular Theban was wealthy enough and connected enough to have an Athenian pot, a really nice wine mixing bowl to be included. So I'm now moving from Thebes as a city of history more to Thebes as a city of myth briefly for the next couple or so of slides. And amongst the myth history of Thebes was, of course, the foundation, Cadmos, great walls with 7 gates, which were erected to the sound of music and so on and so on. But come on down a few generations, and we hit the generation of Laios. And Laios is the father of a certain Oedipus. And Laios is given an oracle, as Cadmos had himself in myth been given an oracle from Delphi. But his oracle is particularly dire. It tells him that if he has a son, that son will grow up to kill him, Laios, and to wed, unbeknownst, of course, his actual mother, and so on and so forth. Well, so sadly is exactly how the Delphic oracle had foretold, because Laios went to great lengths, once a son was born to him, to have him transported out from his his kingdom from Thebes across the borders to be brought up as if he were the son of another ruler. And that is, of course, what Oedipus himself thought. He'd no idea that he was Theban. He thought he was Corinthian. And once, and this is a little bit, of course, of a puzzle, he was traveling northwards and he encounters an old man at a crossroads in central Greece. And he's so incensed that this old man and his small entourage are in his way. He's extremely hot-headed that he kills not only the old man, but all that old man's entourage as well. He proceeds on to Thebes, where he finds the Sphinx is terrorizing the citizens and causing illness and various bad things. But the only way to rid Thebes of the curse of the Sphinx is to answer her riddle. And there are various versions of the riddle of the Sphinx, but the one I suppose that's best known is, what is it that goes on 3 legs in the morning, 2 legs during the day, and 4 legs in the morning, 3 legs in the evening, and 2 legs in the middle of the day? And the answer is man. So as a baby, we crawl along on 4 legs. During the day, upright, 2 legs. In the evening, old, infirm, frail, with a stick, 3 legs. At any rate, that was enough to rid Thebes of the curse of the Sphinx. Oedipus is hailed as a great savior, but having not only achieved the throne, he has also achieved the sadly late King Laios, is recently killed at a crossroads, widow. And with that widow, Jocasta, he's had 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, who are both therefore his children and his half-brothers and half-sisters. And one of those was Antigone. And she has given her name to one of the most famous of ancient Greek plays, the Sophocles play called Antigone, one of 3 plays that Sophocles in the 3rd century BC wrote around Thebes. And he so cleverly represented Antigone as a force of nature, standing up to the man who has succeeded Oedipus as king, because Oedipus has found out the terrible incest and murder of which he's guilty, and put his own eyes out and gone into exile. And his sons have taken over as king, but they fought each other and killed each other in a civil war, so that Creon, you see on the slide here, who is Jocaste's brother, so Oedipus's brother-in-law, as it were, but also uncle, Antigone confronts Creon, accusing him of being a kind of dictator. And that is the story of the Antigone as told on the Athenian stage by Sophocles, round about 440 BC, a very nasty tale indeed. Much more pleasant is the Sphinx as represented here, very clearly female. So just like the Sphinx of the myth, who is a very nasty figure just outside Thebes. But here she's been rather, I think, prettified and domesticated. And this was made by a well-known painter and potter in Athens in the 460s or 450s BC, a very famous, very elaborate pot exported to southern Italy, where it was buried in a grave where it was excavated in the 19th century. Less pleasant is what happened in another cycle of Theban myth, involving, in this case, actually Cadmos. So we're going back some generations. And the descent of the throne comes down to Pentheus. And Pentheus is confronted by the intrusion of what's represented, this is famously in Euripides' play, the Bacchae, the mad women of Thebes. What's represented as a brand new religious cult, and it's the cult of Dionysus, who is actually a god with very strong Theban connections. And it's represented as coming from the east in a dangerous way, unlike Cadmos, who came from the east in a good way. And Pentheus resists. He doesn't think that this is a good type of worship that should be incorporated into the Thebans' religious calendar. And sadly for him, his mother is of the exact opposite persuasion, and her name is Agave, and she's shown on the left of this slide here. And between her and Ino, frenzied in a Bacchic frenzy induced partly perhaps by wine, but also just by suggestion. This is the Greek word ekstasis, means literally you stand outside yourself. So in a complete mad frenzy where she thinks that Pentheus is not a human being, let alone her son, but a wild animal, tears him apart. When she sobers up, she finds the grisly remains of Pentheus. So Theban myth has its very, very dark as well as its light sides. And it is, I think, the dark sides that Athenian dramatists and audiences particularly like to focus on and develop. And that's why we have scenes like this, and that's why we have plays like the Antigone and the Bacchae. There is, though, a lighter side from the Theban point of view, and that's to say, the Athenians regarded all Thebans as Boeotian pigs. This was a gross calumny in its own right, because of course there were Thebans who were immensely sophisticated culturally in terms of, for example, poetry. I mentioned just Pindar. But the slide I'm showing you now is of a vase celebrating a Theban who wasn't a poet, but he was a man who played a certain instrument that was intimately associated with the performance of tragic drama at Athens. It's the aulos, which is sort of like an oboe because it's a reeded instrument. And so you see here a cast of a play with at the center, at the bottom, the celebrated Pronomos, who comes from a family of auletai, of aulos players. And above him, you have none other than Dionysus, the god of the theatre at Athens. So this is a really quite fancy vase celebrating a Theban, and the Thebans were extremely proud of him. Well, now, I've talked about history and myth, and I'm now going very quickly through some events of the 5th and 4th centuries BC to give you a sense of how important Thebes was in the 5th and 4th centuries BC as a historical city. So at my exordium, I told the sad tale of Thebes taking the side of the Persians against the Spartans and Athenians. After the Persians had been defeated, Sparta and Athens fell out. Thebes chose this time to go with Sparta against Athens. And when a huge war broke out, a sort of world war in ancient Greek terms, of which Thucydides is the main historian, Thebans are on the side of the Spartans, and they do very, very well out of what we call the Peloponnesian War, or the Atheno-Peloponnesian War, that occupied pretty much the last third of the 5th century BC, in which Pericles was, to begin with, the Athenian leader. He died. Eventually, irony of ironies, Sparta goes to Persia and says, we need lots of your money especially gold, because we need to build a big fleet. Thebans haven't got a fleet. Sparta hasn't got anything of a fleet. We need to build a big fleet to defeat the Athenians in the Aegean and in the Hellespont. And so it turns out, and the Spartans win. So the Thebans are on the winning side. This is a tombstone of a Boeotian warrior from another Boeotian city, Tanagra, and it just illustrates rather beautifully, I think, the way in which a Theban or in this case a Tanagran might want to be represented heroically in his, yes, shield decorated, but without very much armor, so heroically nude, as it were. I'm now rushing on, covering the next 30, 40 years after the Peloponnesian War. I'm taking you through to 371. During that very confused period, to begin with, Sparta was top dog. Then the Thebans thought, oh dear, they're not being very nice to us. The Thebans perhaps should reconsider their alliance and allegiance, and they indeed did, and went over to the Athenians, who took on the Spartans and lost again. So the Thebans now become an object of enmity for the Spartans. There's a lot of toing and froing, invading of Boeotian territory. Thebans resist, and Thebans are getting better and better at fighting. But at one point, they are suddenly occupied by the Spartans. It's a very both irreligious and therefore illegal occupation. And the Spartans impose on Thebes, as they had imposed on Athens, a very unpleasant, narrow oligarchic regime against which certain liberationist Thebans rebel with the help of Athens, and from the 360s on, Thebes is liberated, but more than just liberated, because the Thebans, at a famous battle, Battle of Leuctra, 371, actually defeat the supposedly mighty Spartans. And that opens the floodgates, the end of Sparta as a great power. Its alliance dissolves. Athens briefly sides with Sparta because it's frightened now of Thebes. That just shows you how these interstate relations are incredibly complex. But during the decade from 370 to 360 in round figures, Thebes becomes top dog. And you see at the top of this slide, Theban hegemony. And that means of all Greece, as it were. Thebes is the most important single power in all Greece, including over Macedon, which is going to become the next major power. And I show you just an illustration of the commonality. The device on the left is the Theban device, a Boeotian type of shield. This is a common coinage uniting all the federal state of Boeotia, including, for example, and here's another Boeotian city, Thespiae. But it all ends in tears with the rise of Macedon under Philip and later Alexander, because the Thebans, who had once been allies of Philip, switch sides to Athens. They are frightened of the kind of domination that Macedon is going to impose on Greece, a kind of autocratic, oligarchic regime involving loss significantly of freedom. And Thebes has become a kind of democracy, as Athens was. A huge battle is fought in Boeotia at a place called Charni or Cheronia. And this lion monument, pieced together from lots of fragments, marks the spot where this major battle of 338 took place, following which the Macedonians imposed a garrison, deprived Thebes of a democracy, imposed an oligarchy, all these nasty things against which the Thebans rose up. In 335, by which time Philip had been assassinated, they rose up against Alexander. Big mistake. Alexander had not yet left for the Orient. He was not dead, as the Thebans believed, a false rumor. And Alexander was in front of the city of Thebes, 500 kilometers he traveled in about 12 days, 300 miles. And as I said, he ordered the destruction of Thebes. And that was the end of Thebes for 20 years totally. And I'm ending on a slightly lighter note because Thebes was rebuilt, but it never recovered its previous power, let alone influence as such. But it nevertheless had a certain reputation as being a fairly pleasant place to live, in which the women of Thebes were particularly thought to be handsome. And though this isn't necessarily a Theban woman, she does illustrate the 3rd, 2nd century BC image of ideal womanhood that these terracotta figurines represent. And then my last 2 slides. The Thebes of myth, of course, doesn't die, even though the Thebes of history temporarily did. And Thebes has a very strong showing in post-Renaissance, especially in music, and then in drama, the way, and indeed in visual art. And here I show early 19th century and portrait of Oedipus and the Sphinx. She's in the left-hand side there, a female figure. And I end with an early 20th century image of a design by Leon Bakst, who worked with Diaghilev within the Ballet Russe from the 1910s through to the end of the 20s. This is 1911. And Bakst both designed and directed a particular ballet set in ancient Boeotia called Narcisse, from which, well, there's another magnificent, I think, dancing Boeotian, or if you like, Theban lady. So if you have been listening, I'm sorry to have gone on rather longer than I should have done. Thank you very, very much.
I also want to say that it's very interesting. I now know you're an archaeohistorian. I never knew that. Thank you for telling me. So it's always, as I say, I learn constantly. Paul Cartledge, certainly, I want to speak about the book for a minute or two, is the author, co-author, editor, or co-editor of numerous books. And under chat, we have both the title of the book and how you can order it. I recommend it so highly. Your erudition just flows naturally, and asserting parallels between Greek, English, and occasionally Latin words. You help us understand the essence of a myth or a political concept, as well as the complexities of lived experiences. Your book, as you've heard today, is not solely about Thebes, but it integrates the city into the polis of a broader Greek realm. And it adds context while emphasizing remarkable personages, we've heard about some of them, and civic values, which enhance the good life. I recommend the book, and I now have assorted questions from the Archaeology Committee members, and maybe we'll take some of those under chat as well. From Jody Woodwitz on the committee. If Thebes was founded by the Phoenician Cadmus, whether true or not, but the myths sometimes are based on a reality that's been transformed. And it's not an ethnic Greek site. Did it contribute in any way to any feeling amongst the other Greek cities that it was somewhat less Greek or defiled or illegitimate, polis?
That's a really, really good question. But when the myth was formulated, the distinction, the ethnocentric distinction between Hellenes and barbarians was not yet formulated in a very negative way. In other words, yes, barbarians did not speak Greek, they're incomprehensible, but that doesn't by definition make them inferior. in every way to every Greek. It did come to acquire that negative signification, which we would call ethnocentric, and actually it's quite unpleasant. It's borderline racist in some cases. But when formulated, it did not hold that negative connotation. And it was for that reason that the Greeks, when they referred to their writing system, what we would call their alphabet, they actually sometimes spoke of Cadmean letters. So some Greeks thought that they knew that the alphabet in some way had originated outside the Greek sphere. And actually they're dead right. It probably did come from what we call Lebanon, that sort of area, south, far east of, west of Syria and the Levant. That's where alphabetic scripts had been around for almost 1,000 years before the Greeks got an alphabetic script, which can be dated to the 8th century BC. So the notion of a Greek alphabet being Cadmean letters could not have been invented before the 8th century BC. And had they thought badly of Cadmos, just because he wasn't a Greek, they wouldn't have then given it an honorific title, Cadmean letters. So that's quite an interesting sort of very early way of getting behind a myth in a way that one can date it. Whereas the foundation of Thebes, which your question has started from, that floats, in the dim myths of time past. So it's once upon a time land, as opposed to historical determining date.
Mm-hmm. My next question comes from Lynn Mayacole. And in a sense, there's a certain relationship because as you spoke, Oedipus was a dark myth. Now he's part of the family. So the question is there any connection with an actual plague early on during the Bronze Age in Thebes at any time? Because that's something we're so concerned of today.
Absolutely, and there is evidence of that sort. You'd need to have osteological analysis in which a particular virus or some sort of disease would be identifiable. To my knowledge, it's not before the 5th century BC, and this is actually why, pretty certainly, Sophocles picks up on the plague dimension of the Oedipus Theban myth story to make his play Oedipus the King, Oedipus Tyrannus, around Oedipus's solving the riddle of the Sphinx, then dealing with the plague. And there isn't, sadly, or perhaps not sadly, but no archaeological correlate, no material documentation of an earlier period such that one could then say, yes, so that element of the myth must go back to that period. It just floats free.
Okay.
But just to add, Michelle, the Iliad begins with the Greeks at Troy. They've come to rescue Helen. They're not doing too well. Troy is very well fortified, and they've been there nearly 10 years. They're in the 10th year when a plague strikes the army encamped by the sea outside the walls of Troy, the Greeks. And this is devastating. Many of them die. And so they want to know why. And the normal explanation in mythical terms is that a god is punishing them. This is a standard ancient mentality. And so they actually find out, this is all in the Iliad, what it is that Agamemnon, specifically the leader of the Greeks, had done wrong. He had grabbed the daughter of a priest of Apollo. He'd seized her as his captive. And the priest starts off the Iliad. He comes to the camp, and it's rather like Priam coming to Achilles right at the end of the Iliad, begging for the corpse of his son Hector. Well, the Chryses, that's what his name is, priest of Apollo, and his daughter Chryseis, they kick off the Iliad. So Greeks who are familiar with their Iliadic tradition since the 8th century at least were not unfamiliar with plague as a major factor in determining how what they would take to be history unraveled. Sorry.
No, that's very interesting. And I want to mention to our audience, at one point when Paul and I had been corresponding about the Parthenon, you said to me, and don't forget the metopes, which depict the sack of Troy. So it's very important. From reading, and this is the book, by the way, what it looks like, and some of the other articles about the book, mention is made that there's the modern city of Thebes on top of the ancient. So Mira's question, Mira Stolman, is about the 7 gates. We haven't found all 7 gates. Is that part of the reason that it can't be excavated? And did 7 have a particular meaning, significance?
Both those questions are very good. And the answer is, though we have the names, the ancient names, and though maybe a couple, it's thought, looking at what would have been presumably the circuit around the Cabareon, this gate, that gate, but not 7, and nothing like 7. And yes, the answer to the second question, 7 was one of those magical numbers, 7 ages of man in Shakespeare and so on, 7-year periods. And it was therefore thought to be, in a way, very, very positive. But it's, on the other hand, it's a very good sign of just how relatively, if I can use the word piddling, ancient Greek civilization was compared with ancient Egyptian in the late Bronze Age, because already in Homer, the poet refers to Thebes in Egypt as having 100 gates. So a mere 7 doesn't look so good.
From Alexander Zacharias on the committee, who happens to be the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And Alexander is asking, how influential was the Boeotian League and the Sacred Band on Philip and later Alexander?
Right, I believe, Alexandros, we may even have met once in the Rockefeller Center, but it may be your father I met some years ago. Anyway, excellent question. And Boeotian League is a phrase I didn't use, but it is indeed a perfectly acceptable phrase, an alternative to Boeotian federal state or federation. And the key point is that Thebes, though itself a major city on its own in the 4th century BC, also had a greater leverage because it was the dominant city of a region, which was quite a large region, and therefore could call on manpower from many parts of Boeotia. The sacred band I didn't mention either because I didn't have time, frankly, but it is one of the most exciting and puzzling phenomena of the entirety of not just Theban, but ancient Greek history. Sacred band suggests some sort of religious connotation or implication, and yet, so far as we know, it was a wholly secular institution. 300, an elite squad of 300. There might have been such a thing in the late 5th century. Remember that tombstone I showed you of Saugenes from Tanagra? Well, conceivably Thebes had a band of 300 then, but the sacred band that you refer to was a new foundation, 378 BC, after Thebes is liberated from Spartan occupation. It engages in a number of both political and military innovations, and one of them, the most striking in a way, is this one. It's not the only one. There are tactical innovations, there are weaponry, there are all sorts of military innovations. Well, the puzzling thing, or the funny thing, the odd thing about this is this was supposedly a band composed of 150 male-male, erotically attached pairs. Now, something which the ancient Greeks called paiderastia, which means passionate love for a youth, typically male, of course. So you have an adult who is passionately attached to an adolescent, paiderastia. There is even a myth that that was invented by Thebes. So you can see the intimate connection between homoeroticism, homosexuality, and Thebes. But normally, as I say, the pairing relationship is lopsided. It's intergenerational. Adult, full citizen, adolescent, sub-citizen. Yet, to fight in the Theban army, you have to be an adult. So the peculiarity of the sacred band is that both members of each couple, the 150 pairs, was an adult. How did the Theban authorities recruit them? Is it the case, I mean, was it just there were so many brilliant Theban warriors around in the 370s, of whom, thankfully, 150 were in a pairing relationship already, such that it was actually quite easy to select 150 out of more than 150 potential applicants for the role? What if one of the pairs died or got cripplingly injured? Was the whole couple removed and replaced, or did the member of the pairing have to find a new mate? You can see what I'm getting at. It's rather hard to think how it actually worked. But to give you the very broad outlines, yes, Philip of Macedon was a hostage when he was a teenager, when Thebes was in its pomp and could dominate Macedon. One of its conditions for the Macedonians keeping quiet was that they surrender a hostage of the royal family to go under house arrest in Thebes. Philip was selected, aged somewhere in his teens, and he was under house arrest in Thebes for 3 years during Thebes's maximum expansion as a political, economic, and military force, within which the sacred band played an absolutely key role, both individually, independently, and as part of the phalanx, the Theban hoplite line. And it was crucial in the battle I mentioned, 371, the victory of the Thebans and its allies over Sparta. It was also sadly crucial, but in the exact opposite sense, in the other major battle that I mentioned, Cabareon, because they died, the 300, to a man. And a mass grave has been excavated containing 254 corpses, all piled next to each other, not far from where that lion you saw in the slide monument has been re-erected. And I think it was probably not put up immediately after the battle, but some people think that was the marker, not just of where the battle happened, but where the Theban sacred band died. What happened to the other 46 corpses? Well, they probably were just mangled, or they had burst, they weren't found soon enough to be buried. So it's a sad tale, but for 40 years, 378 to 338, the Theban sacred band was a very powerful phenomenon. And a good friend of mine, Jamie Rom at Bard College, has written a book all about them, which will come out next year, and I highly recommend it.
I have 3 very quick, and I'm sorry, one I noticed. Are you coming to the club to speak about Sparta? Absolutely. Paul and I had written to each other, when are you doing Sparta? Yeah. And so that is in the offering. We need Paul to come to New York or are continuing with online programs. And I do want to continue with our online programs. I think it's a marvelous way to reach such a large audience internationally, more than could fit into our grand gallery. And this is a prime example of it. So yes, stay tuned. You'll hear about Sparta, definitely. I have one question from the committee that I want to do very quickly. And then I want to go to something online that relates to what you just said about the Theban band. And that is, was there a Theban style? And that comes from Faye Wyatt.
A style of...
Or was it part of this larger Hellenic vocabulary?
I didn't catch the style. Was that the word?
Was there a Theban style per se, or was it part of a larger Hellenic vocabulary, what was produced?
Ah, you mean an artistic style?
Yes, artistic.
Right. Well, there were, yes, because this is typically the case in all Greece before the 4th century BC, that there's a very strong regionalism of style. So that might be expressed in type of artifact, so a particular shape of pottery, or a concentration, and I mentioned the Pataueon and the Pataueon kouros, that extraordinary density of concentration on that one kind of artifact, which actually would go very well, wouldn't it, with what I was saying about naked youths in a pederastic context. You know, I'm not saying one can certainly identify them, but one can certainly tie the nudity to the gymnasium. The ancient Greek word gymnasion meant a place where you exercised gymnos, naked, and in the gymnasium it was, among other things, obviously it was an exercise place, wrestling and so on, but also a pickup joint. So there were very strong connections between nudity of males in art and in life, and homosexuality of the pederastic kind, which the Thebans might have been particularly adept at. By the time you come down to the 4th century, there is a greater homogeneity throughout all Greece. Essentially, the Athenian style in sculpture, in pottery, has really become a Hellenic style. And that's true also of language. The Attic dialect of Greek in the 4th century becomes the universal. And the Greek word is koine, common. So when Greeks spread out after the conquests of Alexander the Great, when they take over Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, Turkey, the Greek that's spoken is koine, common Greek, based on not the Boeotian, not the Doric, not any other regional dialect, but the Athenian dialect, because Athens was the, as it were, capital of culture by the 4th century BCE. But I will mention just one very, very interesting, and it seems to be peculiarly Boeotian and possibly even specifically Theban type of artifact, which is found in one particular shrine, and it's called the Cabareon. It's not far from Thebes, and there is another one actually in Thebes itself. And it's produced a series of retro pots. So whereas by the 4th century in Greece in general, the dominant painted pottery style is what we call red figure. So that the figures are reserved in the clay of the vase and the background is painted in black. The Cabareon style of skyphos, which is a wine drinking cup, had a white background, added wash, with black painted on it, figures in black. And among the scenes, it just happens to be one that I remember, is Kirke, that is the witch goddess in the Odyssey of Homer, who beguiles anybody who has the misfortune to pitch up on her island. She feeds them a drug and they turns them into swine. Very appropriate, actually, for the Boeotian swine. No, I'm sorry about that. And there is a lovely image of Odysseus looking very homely, shall we say, with a very homely Kirke on one of these pots. So it's a kind of pop art, or folk art, which is very peculiarly Boeotian and Theban and tied to the cult of the great gods, the Cabareon, or sometimes it's just one Cabairos, who were a mystery religion. So you get initiated, probably with the accompaniment of a lot of booze, and then you have a better experience and possibly even a better afterlife for being initiated into the mysteries of the Cabareon.
Very quickly now, I'm going to ask for a quick answer because this is fascinating. But I want to let everyone know our next program is also about Greece. It's January 27th, and it's on Crete with Jim Wright in sponsorship with the American School. So I hope you will come to that. And we had a comment made by Peter Feynman, who will be talking on March 4th about Jerusalem before King David. Okay. We had some questions related to women, and you've been talking about male, male, and now male, female. Someone said, well, are women portrayed more evil than men? I didn't particularly like that assumption. Nonetheless, in your book, you mentioned the symposium that in Thebes that women could accompany husbands. It seems more likely than the case in Athens. Could you just for a minute or two, and I thank everyone who stayed on, this has been a brilliant talk, about the relationship of husbands and wives, male and female, and I'm glad my cold is not contagious because this is remote. So I do apologize to everyone if you see this, but you can't catch it. It's not cold. Okay.
I'll start off in the mythical realm before I come to the historical. And you're completely right, Michelle. You pointed out a very interesting and important fact. In the mythical realm, women, with a few exceptions, are not represented as being brilliantly virtuous. And it all starts off with Helen. Did Helen go of her own accord to Troy, i.e., was she a willing adulteress and betrayer of her husband and of the Greeks and all that, causing innumerable damage? 10 years war, many people die, plague, death from fighting, death. You know, in myth, women, and especially, as I pointed out, monstrous women, so the harpies, the spirits who pursue kindred murderers, the Erinyes, translated in Latin as furies, they're all female. Greeks projected, male Greeks projected their fears very often onto women. And some of us think that's partly because they didn't understand female anatomy and they found women in general difficult to pigeonhole. Aristotle, the most rational probably of all the ancient Greeks, had a very bad attitude to women. He thought they were all by nature inferior to all men. I won't go into all the details, but there is a strong strain of misogyny throughout ancient Greek thought, especially in myth, but not only in myth, also in biology. Now, did the Boeotians, the Thebans, practice intersex relations, male-female relations in a different way than the Athenians? Well, there is a little bit of a hint, and maybe I made more of it than I really should, but on a tombstone, in the pedamental bit of it at the top, is a symposium scene. And the dead man is shown on a par with, and one assumes it's his wife. One can't be sure. You know, is it his mistress or is it a female slave? It's not impossible, but I like to think that it's his wife. And indeed, in death, his widow is celebrating what once was a decent, fairly equal relationship, involving even banqueting together. Now move 90 kilometers to the south and east, to Athens, to the land of the symposion. I mean, two Athenians actually wrote philosophical dialogues called the Symposium, Plato, Xenophon. Symposium means a drinking together, and it is very specifically men, male equals, who drink together. because they do so in a space in a house that is called the men's room, as distinct from any female bits of a private house in Athens. To hold a symposium of a private kind, you have to be quite rich, because it involves lavish, maybe gold and silver goblets, nice cushions, blah, blah, blah. Lots of our pottery that survives is part of the repertoire, mixing the wine, ladling the wine out into a nice goblet. I've got one here. I happen to own this. That's about 400 BC. The Athenians made a fetish of the symposium, but the women who were invited, once they'd had a few, were anything but their equals in social and political status. Athenian women were citizens. Some of them were priestesses. Their sexuality was crucial, because to produce the next generation of Athenian men, you have to have legitimacy, and therefore you've got to have a legitimate Athenian wife and mother. But they were regarded as socially inferior, and they were not admitted to drinking parties on an equal basis with their husbands or brothers. And the women who were admitted were either or both, slaves and prostitutes. So to show a woman as that woman is shown on the stele, the funeral stele from Boeotia, woman next to her man, that would be very, well, that was just unthinkable in Athens. So whether or not the Thebans had, if you like, a better attitude to women is hard to argue. Better, I mean, than the Athenians, who did not have a great attitude in general, in my opinion. But there is one story, it's quite an interesting one. When Thebes was under occupation by the Spartans, and they'd been in that way for 3 years, and then Theban exiles mounted a coup, a resistance by subterfuge. The way in which they thought, the best way they thought of inveigling themselves into the inner circle of the governing magistrates of Thebes was to represent themselves, dress up as the sort of women that those Thebans normally would have expected to come to a drinking party as sexual partners, i.e. not their wives. So that suggests something more akin to the Athenian model than the tombstone, which suggests an alternative model.
I just want to say something, and then I'm going to bring this over to Mitch. And Helen calls herself bitch-faced in some of the translations. But as I recall, and I may be incorrect, doesn't Menelaus leave her at one point with Paris to go and see another woman in Crete? In which case, as a 21st century woman, I could understand her fury. I have to say that. And of course, the furies of the women. So we go back to that. But it also says something about how the women were viewed, that she should accept that, even though she came from a better lineage than he did.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure about the factual accuracy of that particular transaction, but it is certainly the case that in the Iliad and Odyssey, Helen is not represented as an independent-minded, independent-thinking person in her own right. She looks much better in the Odyssey, because after she's rescued, Menelaus, as it were, forgives her. She comes back to Sparta, to the palace, and when Telemachus, the young son of Odysseus, wants information about his dad, who's been away 20 years, he goes to Sparta, and he has a little gathering with Menelaus, and Helen serves some rather nice soothing drinks. So she's a very able hostess, but she's not represented as a power. Whereas we've got quite a lot of contemporary Near Eastern, especially Hittite documentation, and Egyptian. So women were indeed used as counters if you like, pawns in a big chess game. But some of them were so independent-minded, so important, that they, as it were, stood up for themselves and caused the men considerable trouble. But Helen caused trouble, but in a purely negative, sort of passive way.
Well, I thank you, and one always learns. And with the pleasure for this extraordinary presentation. Mitch, if you want to now take over and the formal goodbye.
I just want to say thank you to Professor Cartledge and to Michelle on behalf of the National Arts Club for organizing today's program. And we encourage everyone to check out our upcoming programs at nationalartsclub.org. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody, for turning up, listening, and it's been a real pleasure.